So let's talk a little bit about MACV. MACV was established in the early 60s. What most people don't realize that there were actually advisors, U.S. advisors in Vietnam going back to the 50s. I personally know people who served in 54, particularly Air Force people who were assigned to something called MAG, Military Advisory Assistance Group, Vietnam. There was also a MAG for Laos and a MAG for Cambodia. And those kind of disappeared over time, but MAG Vietnam turned to MACV. And the early 61, as most people know, if you've been to Vietnam, you got a Vietnam Service Medal with a 61 bar on it, we call it, and there's no end date, because that was issued by the Vietnamese government. And of course, they didn't end the war, the other side did. But in 61, we started officially sending troops over with the introduction of MACV. And some of the first ones that went over were U.S. Army Special Forces, Green Berets. 12-man teams that had a width and breadth of different experiences and expertise to include language, communications, medical, weapons, quite a variety of different functionality. And they would go in, and their purpose was to train the local indigenous forces. And throughout the time in Vietnam, they did a lot of it by hiring people to work for them. We call mercenaries, but we call them CIDGs, Civilian Irregular Defense Group. And those ended up being soldiers that worked for them, and they came, some of them from other countries, particularly from China. Some of them were called nuns, which was a sect. And what's happened over time, did I lose the screen?
You got to do it here.
Create what they call mobile advisory teams, and these were what some of us refer to as the Poor Men Special Forces. And here you'll see the MACV shield, and you see the country of Vietnam. A little history of Vietnam and what it is. 34 provinces that were broken down into 4 military regions, I Corps, 2, 3, and 4 Corps, or the Delta. The Delta is where I ended up being. And within the Delta were 16 of the provinces. And I was assigned to Dinh Thuong, which is basically outlined in the red circle that you see there. It was 560 plus square miles. Roughly rectangular. The southern border was the Mekong River. Flowed from Phnom Penh down directly across the bottom. Also within that province, and you'll see that shortly, were some several interesting points that go back in history. But this is one of the leading agricultural provinces in the country. The capital was Mito. This is a map that was created by an advisor and found in his book called You Ain't Nothing But a Swamp Rat. And what you'll find is here's the capital city of Mito. For those of you who are familiar with a little bit of history, the first major battle that took place in Vietnam was Vietnamese against the Viet Cong and ultimately NVA at a place called Ot Bach. Ot Bach is located right up here. And that was the Arvin 7th Division. Their senior advisor was a lieutenant colonel of the Army by the name of John Paul Vann, who gained fame later as he retired, went back as a civilian working for the State Department, and ultimately ended up being the equivalent of a Corps commander when he unfortunately died in a helicopter crash in 2 Corps in June of 1972. What's interesting about this map is the guy who wrote the book, John Bonville, actually spent 2 tours as a district senior advisor within Vietnam. His first tour was right down in this area, and his second tour was right in this area. And this is a map from the time that the 9th Infantry Division served in Vietnam and moved to a place called Dong Tam. And Dong Tam is right there, right at the base of the river and the Long Dinh Canal, which comes down through here. When I first got to Vietnam, I went to the U.S. Army Advisor School in Zion in 3 Corps, which is up close to Benoit in that area, for 3 weeks. Then I was assigned to the Delta with Can Tho, and then from Can Tho I was transferred up to Advisory Team 66 in Mito. Now here's an actual depiction of the province with the districts. The districts changed names over time. In fact, when I was there, it's called Vinh Kim or Long An District, but when I was there, it was called Sam Yang District, and that was in 1970, and this was from 69. So it changed frequently. But what you'll find is, particularly with the organization of what happened in Vietnam over time, a number of different things. For instance, you'll see a name here, Lieutenant Colonel Hackworth, famous Army officer, highly decorated, operated in that area. Another area is the wagon wheel, we called it up here. And that was the intersection of various roads and canals, and also we put a big artillery base from the 9th Infantry Division there. Within the province, the 44 provinces in Vietnam were all broken out and generally had this same type of an organizational structure. This is the advisory team that worked in each of the provinces. So you had a province senior advisor, normally was either an 06 full colonel, or it would be a civilian, an FSR, Foreign Service Officer, FSS2 or FSR2. And then under that, you'll see mobile advisory teams. In the case of the province I went to, we had 15 advisory teams, or mobile advisory teams when I got there. 15 5-man teams. And 6 months later, it was cut back to 2, and we were scaled down to 3-man teams. These are the conventional U.S. type of a military organization. You've got your S1, your S4, those type of functions. But this is the other side we call CORD, Civil Operation Rural Development System. And there's unique aspects of that. We interface very little with that unless it just kind of fell in our lap, which it did at times. But you'll see there's different organizations there that did their own thing. In fact, that was the majority of the people that were assigned to the advisory team was on the CORD side. And they were out there from aid from international development or AID, USAID, and State Department and other organizations. This is the classic NAT team. When it was at strength, it would have 5 people, normally headed up by a captain, in some cases first lieutenants. Then you would have another lieutenant, and then 3 NCOs, usually light weapons infantry, heavy weapons infantry, which is basically mortars, and then there'd be a medic. In the case of my team, we also had an interpreter attached, and we also had an engineer. And the engineer we had was because the area we went into was so heavily booby-trapped and had a major battle during Tet of '68 that there was all sorts of unexploded ordnance still left a year and a half later. And we operated off contracts. And I have a copy, this is actual copies of the MET contract. It's in English. I also have a Vietnamese version, and it's signed and dated and stamped by the Vietnamese. But the essence of what's in the contract is what you see on the left. We were typically supposed to go in, the reason we're called mobile advisory teams, we were supposed to operate for 30 to 60 to 90 days in these different areas. And we went in, and our mission was to train the Vietnamese, and that was the local territorial forces, in this case, 3 PF platoons, 30 days with each of them. And then we were also to provide support to the villages, to include part of a program of their security. And security is multifaceted. That's the reason why we had the other parts of the Corps people involved. On the other side, this is what the villages look like. Now, let me take a minute and explain the village concept. Vietnam is organized, as I said before, in 44 provinces. And then I said there's military regions, but that's not a real delineation. But the 44 provinces, we think of it kind of like states. So there were 44 states, but there were no counties, per se. The districts that we had were military districts. They weren't civilian districts. So the form of government in Vietnam was you had the country, then it went down to the province level, which would be like the state level, then it went down to villages, the 2,500 villages in the country of Vietnam. And a village is comprised of anywhere from 4 to 11 what we call hamlets. There were 12,000 hamlets in Vietnam. So what we ended up working with, based on my contract, were 3 villages and their associated hamlets. But this shows how those villages were operating. And typically what you'll see is noted up here, if the village had 5,000 or more people, it had augmented forces to help support it from an administration side. Now, if you think back, and if you know anything about the history of this area, Vietnam has been in a state of flux and has been in a state of war for thousands of years. People don't realize that. Before World War II, it was called French Indochina because it had been taken over by the French. It was a French occupied and run country. And it was exploited by the French. The Japanese came in and took it over. The Vietnamese never knew freedom. And they had no concept of what freedom is. You and I understand freedom. But they were governed after World War II by what remnants of the Vietnamese had worked administratively for either the Japanese or had worked administratively for the French, with all the associated bureaucracy, with all the associated corruption that were in with those governments. And what we tried to do is come back in at a late date, starting in 67, 68 with the courts program, to work directly with these people and try to help them understand and appreciate the benefits of democracy and help get them organized for that. And that's part of what we were doing. We were military, but we also had a civilian role. That was to help this government get started and operate. This was the first organization that I went to, January of 1971. That's a bridge over a river. That bridge is what we call Co Van Sop. Ko is Vietnamese for bridge. I went to language school for 3 months before I went over there, so I had a rating of me, Tarzan, you, Jane, and speaking the language. And then I got over there and found out that most of the Vietnamese had never been to school, so they spoke slang, and there were colloquialisms that we didn't understand, so it took another 3 months to understand what they were saying. This is the first platoon we went to, was 247 PF platoon. This was territorial forces. These did not exist before the Americans got over there. There was a Arvin Army. Most people have heard of the Arvins. Some people refer to them as Marvin the Arvin. And the others that we had were called PSDF, People's Self-Defense Force. They wore black pajamas, and they had a little patch on their pocket, if they could afford it, that actually looked like the country of Vietnam was a blue circle. And I have photos up here if anybody's interested in what those look like. But that's all they had. So what they organized were what they call popular forces, or Neoquin, which is what this is. The Neoquin were organized in platoons. Typically, they were authorized 35 people. I never saw a platoon with more than 26 people in it. And then they had the Dia Phu Quan, which were the regional forces, or RFs. They were organized into companies. Same thing. At full strength, they would be 125 men. But I never saw any of those over about 75, just because of attrition and trying to keep people there. They had desertion rates, but also high casualty rates. And this shows the PF platoon when we first got there. If you notice, they are kind of a ragtag bunch. That's because when they first got organized, they were issued one uniform. Over time, it wears out. They were never given replacements. They wore black tennis shoes, high-top tennis shoes, if they had them. Most of the time, the ones we worked with, they'd worn those out, so they went barefoot. They see a smattering. Some of them are wearing shirts, some are wearing pants, some are wearing hats that are military. But most of the time, they were out of it. And these were poor people. These lived out in the villages, in the hamlets, out in the countryside. The government had no other resources for them. And they were basically low-paid soldiers. They typically averaged somewhere in the range of what you and I would expect to be $15 to $20 a month paid to serve in the military. And they were like citizen soldiers. They worked full-time. They worked when they could, but they also supported their families, grew crops, and that type of thing. And this is some pictures that were taken in the area that we lived in at Teta, 1971, late January, early February. And one of the things I'd like to point out is, regardless of the houses, and you'll see some of the houses as you go through, but this one, every house had a shrine. About 80% of the population of Vietnam were Buddhist. The different sects of Buddhism. You have Cao Dai, you have Wahao. Ours typically were Wahao. And you can see that the men all ate together. And they had an interesting way of doing it. These people were poor. They had very little to eat. And their big meal for Tet, the big holiday, was duck. And they would take a duck and they would scald the feathers, pull it off, lay the duck down on the board, and take a knife or a cleaver and start and just go all the way through. Now, they never gutted it, so you had all sorts of interesting things in that pot that was left. And as the honored guest, no one ate till I ate. So I thought I would be smart, and I would look through and I'd see a piece of intestine, or I'd see a kidney, something I knew I didn't particularly want. So I would reach for like that wing or part of that drumstick or a nice piece of the breast, something like that, and put that in my bowl. And I'd turn around and smile at them and nod my head. They would load my bowl up with all the delicacies, the liver, the kidneys, all that stuff. So I learned from then on. I went through that before anybody ate and put all of those delicacies, honored them, and put it in their bowl. And when there was something left in there that I thought I could eat, then I would give them the go-ahead, and then they would honor me with stuff I could eat. And then the kids and the ladies ate after everybody else did, if there was food left over. These are some of the activities that we got involved with. When I said that we did military training, I'll explain. On that first PF platoon, there were 24 people. We lined them up and inspected their weapons. They had M16s and one M79. And when we inspected them, 3 of the M16s did not work. They were frozen shut. So I started asking questions of why this was. And the answer was that in Tet of 68, the VC had come through and had blown up that bridge that I showed you in the earlier picture. There was a triangular mud fort that was next to it that the PFs lived in. They overran that and destroyed it. And the PFs had World War II era weapons, carbines, M1 Garands, and I believe one BAR, Browning automatic rifle. They were literally wiped out. And when it was reconstituted, they still had the same kind of weapons, but then in late 68, early 69, some trucks came in from the government, took all those weapons, and issued them by kicking out of the back of the truck M16s and a couple of cases of ammo. No instruction or anything else. They never had training on how to zero those weapons. They never had instruction or training on how to clean those weapons. And so that's what we first found, was that 3 of those weapons were literally frozen solid because they were corroded and never cleaned. And I asked these guys, why are you carrying this weapon on operations if you know it doesn't work? And the answer I got was, if Buddha wants me to live, he'll make it work. So we had our hands full. We also trained them on weapons that they might encounter but not had exposure to. And a good example of that is the center one. They weren't authorized as a PF unit to have M60 machine guns, but we did. My unit, my team had 3 of them. So we wanted to make sure they knew how to operate it in case things got a situation where they needed to use it. And then another classic training class, Claymore mines, M18 mines. We use those for defense of our positions at night. We also used them on ambushes. Let's talk a little bit about the CORD side, Civil Operation Rural Development. We would bring in the experts. Most of the guys who work for AID actually came from the Philippines, and they spoke Vietnamese very well. They had been there for a while. And they were trying to teach them. In the Delta, they grow 3 rice crops a year. But they also augment their diets with things besides rice. They have greens that go into it. They use carrots, they use cabbage, all the standard stuff that we do, but they'd have to buy it at the market. So what we tried to do is work through the village and the hamlet system to say, this hamlet, they'll cut back a little bit on your rice, and let's have you grow something like carrots. And then you have something to take to the market. So we were trying to educate them on that piece of it. And what you see here are some of the options on that. One of the great ones, you see all the white back there, those are ducks. Standard food. Mostly in the Delta, you would expect them to eat fish, and they do. They eat a lot of seafood. But duck is another valuable resource for several reasons. One, it makes an excellent sentry. So if you put those outside your villages, they'll warn you if anybody comes, day or night, doesn't matter. Friend or foe, it doesn't matter. They will squawk and raise a ruckus. And then you can see here, they're actually growing onions, and I'm not even sure what this is, kind of like cilantro. And this gives you a better idea. You can see the diverse amount of crops off this photo that was taken. That's actually on the Mekong River. That's the Mekong River there, and this is a tributary that goes up. But you can see different crops that were growing in that area. And then the other thing we do is we bring in agriculture experts. In this case, there's a vet who's actually, when I say a vet, a veterinarian who's actually giving an injection to a water buffalo. So some type of antibiotic or whatever. When I talk about this being the rice basket of Asia, I mentioned the 3 crops, but what I wanted to kind of show you was a little bit of how they do the crops. And if you notice here, you can see about planting, but if you notice, it's all hand planted. they sow the rice and the water very, very thick, and then they go grab a clump of it and they take it out and spread it by hand. And that's what they're doing here and here. And this kind of shows you how it grows like that. And then when the water starts waning, you can see how those clumps are still there. And this is an interesting photo. I took this one day coming back to our site. You see the field is dry. This is just before the rainy season started. And this kid was walking carrying these baskets. But what you can't tell very well, maybe you can see it from there, he's got a crate, which is a snake, deadly poisonous snake, hanging off the back of it. He came across it and he killed it. He was taking it home for dinner. And then the major highways, this is what we call QL4. And I-Corps, they had QL1, and 2-Corps QL2, 3-Corps QL3. The major highway that ran all the way from the DMZ all the way down to Canton. And this is QL4. And they would just take a section of it and dry their rice on it. Block traffic. The other thing that we did was MedCaps, Medical Civic Action Programs. So what you'll see here is U.S. and Vietnamese medical people working to treat the people in the contested areas. We'd have to go out with security, unannounced, and the people would hide in their houses. They wouldn't come out. And we would set up, but the first ones that typically would come out would be the kids. The curiosity kids would come out. And what I would do, you can see me doing it there, I would pass out candy to them. I was bribing them to come in to be treated. And when they would come in, then the adults would come in to see what we were doing with the kids. And that's how we got medical treatment to the people. Daily activities. A 5-man team. We had a platoon of 24 people. And you say, well, you're supposed to do training. You saw the MET contract. We're supposed to do training and all these different things, but there's other life activities we have to do. So I just wanted to kind of highlight what we did during the day, every day. Security was our #1 item. We were grossly outnumbered, and you have to rely on the Vietnamese for protection and security. So we quickly formed bonds, but you always held that little doubt in the back of your mind of whether they're going to turn on you. Next was safety. We always checked weapons and the perimeter to make sure that the mines and security devices we had on our perimeter were always functioning first thing in the morning. They hadn't been turned around on us or disconnected. Sanitation was a big area. And that was one of the big things we also did as part of the MedCaps. They were ignorant on basic sanitation processes. So we tried to get them involved with that. I'll show you a little bit of how we do that. Here is something we call SPs, or sundry packs. Anybody familiar with SP packs? Anybody use them in Vietnam or other areas? Show of hands? Okay. So SP packs were really, it was a box about 35 pounds. And in there were 3 smaller boxes, all wrapped in heavy plastic, protected from the elements. This is the tobacco pack. It had 10 cartons of cigarettes. It also had 4 or 5 packs of chewing tobacco, a couple of packs of pipe tobacco, pipe cleaners, that kind of stuff, even flints, but no fluid, plus there were a bunch of gopher matches. You know, you strike one and go for another one type match. And then there was a stationary pack, and the stationary pack had the airmail envelopes, it had tablets, it had pens, it had shoelaces, that type of stuff that we could use. And then it also had soap. So it had a couple bars of laundry soap, And then it had like 24 bars of bath soap. So that was more than what we could use. And then over here is the confectionery pack, it was called. Basically, 24 packs of candy. We'd have about a half a dozen different boxes of candy, everything from Hershey bars to what have you. And that was the candy we'd use to bribe the kids. The cigarettes we used to bribe the soldiers. Most of them had more experience as soldiers than we had. They had been fighting for years, but they weren't educated on how to zero their weapons. They weren't educated on how to clean their weapons. So we'd set up a system and say, okay, whoever shot the best zero got a carton of American cigarettes. Whoever has the cleanest weapon gets a carton of American cigarettes. That's how we bribe them. The last thing I want to point out on the slide is the last, it says no standard routines or schedules. So I told you that these soldiers were citizen soldiers. They had other duties. So when it came time to do training, we picked a particular time and day to hold a class and let them know just a few hours in advance so that we would protect our security as well as them. Give them enough notice they could rearrange their schedule. We never had 100% participation because somebody was always tied up elsewhere. But we weren't going to get into any patterns. So this is the neighborhood. This is where we lived. Get around here where I can point. That was our Navy. That was MET 25, Mobile Advisory Team 25. That was our Navy. We lived in the Delta. When I first got there, the team was at a place called Median High, or Median number 2, Vietnam and what we did. And that pretty sums up this piece of it. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
I don't have a question, but you talk about the food that you were eating.
The what?
The food.
Yes.
That you ate. I'm a physician, and what we would have is a situation in which we would operate, for example, on the Vietnamese. And if we took care of a kid, they would kind of feel obligated to invite us for dinner.
Yes.
Now, we would have a scarf. One guy that just loved that stuff that you wouldn't eat. And we would send Dave out. Well, there was an intelligence officer who shows up one day, and he asked if he could go along. He'd been to the school in Monterey and spoke Vietnamese and wanted to practice Vietnamese. Well, when the two of them came back, Dave was red-faced, and this intelligence officer was green-faced. And Dave was furious, and we said, what the hell happened? He's yelling, never have I been so embarrassed in all my life. This jerk, this moron. He describes the food, just what you were talking about. We're going to... And he said, this guy walks out and barfs all over this lady's vegetable garden. And you have to be careful with the food because in the United States, if you get a belly wound, the surgeons, when they open up, they run the bowels, they call it. And the reason is they're looking for a hole in the bowel. Because a hole in the bowel, if not closed, is an 80% death rate. And so we didn't do it with the Vietnamese or the Koreans, because all you had to do is look for where the worm was, sticking out of the hole.
Yeah. All right, a question here. Yeah, we had cords in the name, and we used to get around them frequently. I always thought they were CIA. They were more spooks than anything, and they were pretty rough guys.
We refer to the CIA as Embassy House. And that's, I'm serious, that's what it was called, was Embassy House. They did kind of their own thing. We interfaced with them periodically when they wanted some assistance in a particular operation that they were going on because they had their own mercenaries called PRUs, Province Reconnaissance Unit. And these were all convicted felons who'd been released from prison, but were not political prisoners. They were there for murder, rape, robbery, that kind of thing. Perfect for the CIA.
Quick question, did you all have a cook, or did you have the locals cook for you?
We kind of did our own cooking, but the hooch maid, the mama san that we had that washed the clothes, did the cooking.
I got another question here. We've got time for about 2 more.
Colonel, how did you receive your commission?
OCS.
All right.
Yeah, that part of the slide kind of disappeared at the beginning, but I had a background slide that was up there, and what I had is a picture of my parents. My parents were both in the Navy during World War II. My father was a soldierman on a DE, destroyer escort. My mom worked for the Department of the Navy in Washington, D.C., and they met when my dad came up to visit the USO.
Where did you go to language school?
Say again?
Where did you go to language school?
I went to language school at what they call DLISW, which is Southwest or Fort Bliss.
How did you get resupplies, and what were your communications out of there?
Say again?
How'd you get resupplied, and what were your communications like trying to get information out?
The communications we had was called a PRIC 25, PRC 25. That's all we had. And we had to use CAC codes if we wanted to encrypt. Otherwise, everything went in the clear. And we got resupplied by sending guys back into province to the country store. You saw on one slide it mentioned country store. But that was basically a place where you could go in and get groceries, whatever they had in stock. And it was catch as catch can, so we augmented it. Fortunately, we lived in the Delta, so we ate a lot of seafood because we could buy it locally. Shrimp, lobster, that type of thing.
All right, we're going to have to cut it off right now, but save your questions for David for later. We do have